Picture the horizon at dawn. Nothing moves except grass, endless and pale gold, bending under a wind that never seems to stop. Then, out of the silence, a shape, low to the ground, dragging something behind it. Not a horse, not a wagon, not a single hoofbeat anywhere on the wind. A dog. Behind it, two long poles scrape through the dirt, cutting twin lines into the earth that will still be visible tomorrow and the day after, until the rain finally erases them. Between those poles, tied tight with rawhide, rides everything a family owns. Dried meat, folded hides, a child too small to walk the distance, a grandmother too old to keep the pace. For hundreds of years, this was the sound of survival on the Great Plains. Not hooves, not wheels, just the soft, relentless drag of wood against grass, mile after mile, season after season, in a rhythm so constant it became invisible to the people who lived inside it. The way a heartbeat is invisible to the person whose chest it beats in. You've been told a story about the plains, a story with horses in it from the very beginning. Riders silhouetted against burning orange skies, chasing buffalo across a sea of grass that seems to have no edge. That image is burned into nearly every film, every painting, every schoolbook illustration of indigenous life in North America. But that image is late, very late. Before a single horse ever set foot on this continent in the way we imagine it now, an entire civilization had already solved one of the hardest problems a human society can face: how to move everything you own, every few weeks, across hundreds of miles of open land, without roads, without wheels, without draft animals larger than a dog, and survive doing it. They solved it by building something almost embarrassingly simple. And in that simplicity hides one of the most overlooked engineering achievements in North American history. This is the story of the device history forgot, the Travois, and the story of why underestimating it would be a mistake. Because once you understand what it took to build, maintain, and depend on this system for thousands of years, you start to see the plains not as an empty backdrop waiting for horses to arrive and make it cinematic, but as a place already full of engineers, breeders, and strategists, quietly solving one of the hardest survival problems on the continent, with nothing but wood, hide, and a working animal small enough to feed. Here's something most people never stop to consider, because modern life has erased the question entirely. How do you move a village? Not a person with a backpack. Not a family loading a car. A village. Tents. Dried meat stores. Tools for hunting, for cooking, for sewing hides into shelter. Children too young to walk 12 miles. Elders whose knees can't take the terrain. Everything that keeps 40, 60, 100 people alive through a Dakota winter, and you have to move it again and again, sometimes every few days, because the buffalo do not wait for you, and neither does the first blizzard of the season. No wheels. A wheel needs a road, or at least flat, dry, predictable ground, and there was none of that here. A wheel sinks in mud. It snaps against embedded rock. It jams the moment snow gets deep enough to matter. On the open plains, a wheel isn't a convenience. It's a liability waiting to strand you 100 miles from the nearest river. No horses. Not for thousands of years of plains life. The horse, as most people imagine it in this story, the animal fused to indigenous identity in almost every popular depiction, didn't exist here yet. That part of the story comes later, much later. So what do you actually have if you are a Lakota family, a Cheyenne family, a Crow, Blackfeet, or Arapaho family, standing in open grassland with a camp that has to move by sundown? You have dogs, and you have your own back. That's the entire toolkit. And from that narrow, unglamorous starting point, the Plains nations engineered something that, by any honest measure, should not have worked as well for as long as it did. Later generations, borrowing a French-derived word, would call it the Travois. But the idea predates any European presence on the continent by centuries, possibly longer. Two long poles lashed together at one end into a narrow V. That V rests across the shoulders of a dog like a harness built from sinew and hide. The wide end trails along the ground behind the animal, and stretched across that wide end, a woven platform or netting holds the cargo steady. Simple, right? Almost too simple to be called technology at all. That's exactly what makes it dangerous to dismiss. Because simple things, engineered correctly, survive centuries. Complicated things collapse under their own weight. And this quiet wooden frame outlasted empires. A dog is not large. Working dogs of the plains average somewhere between 40 and 70 pounds. Strong animals, but nowhere near the size of an ox or a horse. And yet, these same dogs were routinely loaded with 50 to 75 pounds of cargo, sometimes more in especially strong animals, meaning some dogs dragged a load close to their entire body weight across open ground for miles day after day, in heat, in cold, in mud. Stop and sit with that number for a second. Imagine strapping a load equal to your own body weight to your back and walking 12 miles. Now, imagine doing it again tomorrow, and the day after that. So, how do you keep an animal alive and functional under that kind of strain, generation after generation, without burning through your entire working population of dogs in a single hard season? You don't overload one dog. You build a system. A single family didn't rely on one Travois dog. They relied on several, sometimes a dozen or more, depending on the household's size and wealth. The weight was distributed. The risk was distributed. If one dog tired, or twisted a leg on uneven ground, or simply needed rest, the whole system didn't collapse. It adjusted. Another dog absorbed part of the load. A person carried the rest by hand for a stretch. The march continued. This wasn't improvisation dressed up as tradition. This was logistics, refined over uncounted generations of trial, failure, and correction. Think about what that correction process actually looked like in practice. There was no manual, no blueprint passed down on paper. Every adjustment, how tight to lash the poles, how much give to leave in the harness so it didn't chafe an animal's shoulders raw after 10 miles, how to angle the platform so cargo didn't slide sideways on a slope, was learned the hard way, tested against real consequences, and passed down through observation, through hands guiding younger hands, through decades of watching what worked and quietly abandoning what didn't. That kind of knowledge doesn't survive by accident. It survives because a culture treats it as essential, teaches it deliberately, and refuses to let it die with any single generation. And logistics, not luck, not landscape alone, is what separates a people who survive one hard winter from a people who survive for centuries in the same unforgiving environment. You'd assume the dog was simply an animal doing a job because it had no choice. A beast of burden, nothing more. Look closer, though, at how these dogs were selected, raised, and bred, and a very different picture starts to form. These were not random dogs pulled in from the wild. They descended from long lineages of North American dogs shaped deliberately across generations for exactly this kind of labor. Strong shoulders built to bear the harness without injury. Sturdy legs conditioned for long, repetitive strain. A calm, steady temperament. an animal that would walk for hours without panicking, without veering sideways, without breaking the line of march when a rabbit darted through the grass or thunder rolled somewhere over the horizon. In other words, this was never simply a dog wearing equipment. This was equipment and animal, evolved together, deliberately shaped side by side over centuries into a single working unit that functioned almost like one machine built from two living parts. That single fact should change the way you picture the whole system. A transport technology built only out of wood and rawhide is impressive on its own. A transport technology that also includes decades, likely centuries, of selective animal breeding, behavioral conditioning, and inherited working instinct, passed down the way a craft or a language is passed down, that's not a tool anymore. That's an institution, a living, breathing piece of cultural infrastructure. And institutions do not appear by accident. They appear because a people's survival depended on them, and depended on them enough to be worth building carefully, testing constantly, and refining without end. Now, picture the actual moment of departure. Not a peaceful morning stroll into the distance. A tense, high-stakes operation executed under pressure that modern life rarely demands of anyone. A camp preparing to move wasn't casual. It was often closer to a race, against weather turning hard on the horizon, against a buffalo herd drifting just out of range, against rival groups who might be watching the same stretch of territory with the same hungry intent, against the blunt, unforgiving math of food stores running low with no warning. Everything had to come down fast and go back together just as fast on the other end. The long lodge poles that held up the home itself, the very structure a family slept inside the night before, doubled in many groups as the poles used for the Travois, multi-purpose by necessity. Nothing wasted, nothing extra, nothing carried that didn't earn its place. The tippy cover became a wrapping for cargo. The lashings that held up a home became the harness binding cargo to a dog's shoulders. A shelter became a transport vehicle within the space of a single hour. Women typically directed this transformation, loading, balancing, lashing, calming animals that sensed the urgency in the air, organizing children, elders, and the injured into a moving line that had to hold together for miles. This was not background labor, tucked away and unnoticed. This was command-level logistics, executed under real-time pressure by people whose competence in that exact moment determined whether the group ate in a week or didn't. Miscalculate a load, and a dog collapses mid-trail, cargo scattered across the grass. Hours of daylight lost recovering it. Balance the poles wrong, and they snap under strain somewhere between one camp and the next, with no workshop, no replacement lumber, nothing but what the land happens to offer nearby. Every single travois, on every single day of movement, represented a small, high-stakes engineering decision, made quickly, made correctly, over and over, for longer than most nations in written history have existed, and picture the sound of it all happening at once. Dozens of dogs barking, straining, adjusting to new weight settling onto their shoulders. Poles creaking against rawhide knots pulled tight in seconds by hands that had done this 1,000 times before. Children herded into position along the moving line, someone calling out which direction the scouts had confirmed was safe. All of it happening in the same narrow window of time, with no do-over if it went wrong, no second camp to retreat to if the first attempt failed. And they got it right. Consistently. For centuries. That consistency is the part that deserves far more attention than it usually gets. Here's a detail that tends to catch people off guard the first time they hear it. The travois wasn't only built to carry supplies, It also carried people, the very young, the very old, the injured, the sick, anyone whose body could not keep pace with a moving camp. They were placed onto the Travois platform, secured, and pulled along with everything else the family owned. In a landscape where falling behind meant real danger, exposure to the elements, separation from the group, predators drawn to the weak and the slow, the Travois functioned less like a moving truck and more like an ambulance stitched together from wood and hide. Sit with what that actually means for a moment. This was never only a system for moving objects from one camp to the next, it was a system for keeping the entire group alive together, as a unit, refusing to let anyone fall out of the circle simply because they were too small, too old, or too injured to walk under their own power. The technology itself was a physical expression of a value the culture held at its core, that the group survives together, or it does not survive at all. That is not a minor footnote buried in the middle of this story. That, arguably, is the actual heart of the entire design. The reason the whole system was worth building this carefully in the first place. For thousands of years, this was the ceiling. Dogs, poles, human effort, and constant careful calculation, refined endlessly, but bound by the physical limits of a 40-pound animal. And then, in the 1500s and 1600s, something arrived on this continent that had not existed here in over 10,000 years. The horse. Brought by Spanish colonizers, the horse spread northward across the continent over the following century, through trade between nations, through raiding, through animals that escaped captivity and bred freely in the wild, eventually reaching the Plains nations and reshaping their world from the ground up. And when it arrived, it didn't simply add another option to the toolkit. It broke the ceiling entirely, all at once. A horse could carry by many estimates 6 to 8 times what a dog could manage. Loads that once required an entire coordinated team of dogs could now be handled by a single animal, moving faster, farther, with far less daily risk of collapse or injury. The Travois design itself, the poles, the platform, the underlying engineering logic that had been refined over unknown centuries, didn't need to be reinvented from nothing. It was adapted. Larger poles to bear the greater weight, wider platforms to hold the larger loads. The same fundamental idea, now harnessed to an animal several times more powerful than anything that had pulled it before. The horse Travois was born not from a new idea, but from an old, proven idea suddenly handed far more raw power to work with. Consider what that meant in practical terms. A family that once needed 6 or 8 dogs, each carefully bred, trained, fed, and managed to move their essential belongings, could now achieve the same result, or far more, with 1 or 2 horses. The labor of loading, balancing, and monitoring a dozen animals collapsed down to managing a handful. Distances that once took days on foot with a dog team could now be covered in a fraction of the time. What had been the outer limit of possibility for thousands of years suddenly became a starting point, and the effects rippled outward through nearly every part of Plains life, reshaping it in ways that still define how the world pictures these cultures today. With horses came an entirely different relationship to distance itself. Hunting ranges expanded dramatically. Groups could now follow buffalo herds across territory that would have been physically impossible to cover on foot with dog teams alone. Wealth began to be measured differently, not simply in stored food or tools, but in horses, in what a family could move, defend, and command. Warfare changed with the same speed. Mobility and conflict changed. Even the visual identity of Plains cultures. The image now burned so deeply into global memory. the mounted warrior framed against a dying sunset, did not exist before this shift arrived. That image, so central to how the world imagines Indigenous Plains life, is actually a relatively recent chapter layered on top of a much older, much longer story. But here's the twist almost nobody mentions when they tell this history. The dog Travois didn't disappear the moment horses arrived. Even long after horses became central to Plains life, dogs continued pulling smaller loads. They continued serving families who didn't yet have enough horses to rely on. They continued functioning in situations where a horse wasn't practical, wasn't available, or wasn't worth risking on a short errand close to camp. The old system didn't vanish into history the instant something bigger arrived. It became the backup. The everyday workhorse for smaller, humbler jobs, still visible in written accounts and visual records well into the 1800s, long after the horse had already reshaped the broader culture. Which means that for a long stretch of history, both systems ran side by side, the ancient method quiet and modest, and the new one dramatic and transformative, overlapping, coexisting. Neither one fully replacing the other for generations. History rarely replaces itself in a single clean line, the way textbooks like to suggest. It layers. Old solutions linger inside new ones, doing quiet work in the background, long after they've stopped being the headline. So why does a simple wooden frame, dragged by a working dog through the grass, deserve this much attention centuries later? Because it quietly destroys a myth that has been repeated so often, it starts to feel like settled fact. The idea that Plains cultures were somehow static, somehow waiting, until European contact and the horse arrived to activate them into the mobile, iconic societies now pictured in film and photography. That version of the story runs backwards. These nations were already mobile, already sophisticated, already solving one of the hardest logistical problems any human society can face, moving an entire community repeatedly across brutal terrain with no roads and no draft animals larger than a dog, through an engineered system involving deliberate animal breeding, careful material science, coordinated teamwork, and constant adaptive problem solving. All of this existed centuries before a single horse ever touched this soil. The horse did not create Plains mobility. It accelerated something that had already been built, tested, and perfected over an extraordinary length of time. And that distinction matters because it changes who deserves credit for the underlying innovation. Not the colonizers who happened to bring horses across an ocean. The indigenous nations who had already developed the core concept, mobility as a survival strategy, engineered transport as a genuine cultural pillar, and who simply scaled that existing concept upward the moment a more powerful tool became available to them. Credit follows the idea, not the animal that happened to arrive later and make the idea louder. It's worth pausing on why this correction matters beyond historical fairness. When a culture's own innovations get quietly erased from the record, folded instead into the arrival of an outside animal, an outside people, an outside technology, the story that survives isn't just incomplete. It's inverted. The people who did the actual engineering, the actual breeding, the actual centuries of trial and adjustment disappear from their own achievement. Restoring the Travois to its rightful place in this story isn't a minor footnote correction. It's putting the authorship back where it belongs. There is something almost poetic about a piece of technology built from nothing more than wood, rawhide, and a dog's willingness to walk steadily beside a person it trusted. It required no metal, no wheel. No animal larger than a family could comfortably feed, train, and manage on its own. And yet it moved entire communities across one of the harshest, most exposed landscapes on the continent, herding families through blizzards, through drought, through the relentless, unending chase of the buffalo. For longer than most empires in recorded history have managed to survive. It leaves behind a quiet question. If you let it sit for a moment, what actually counts as advanced technology? Is it complexity, size, metal, machinery, and moving parts? Or is it fit, a solution matched so precisely to its environment, its available materials, and its people's real immediate needs that it simply works, generation after generation, without ever needing to be grander than it already is? The dog Travois was never loud. It never announced itself the way a galloping horse does, thundering across open ground with obvious, undeniable power. It dragged quietly through tall grass, carrying a family's entire world balanced across two wooden poles, and the simple, unspoken trust between a person and the animal, walking steadily at their side. And maybe that is the real lesson buried inside this forgotten piece of history. Easy to miss if you're only looking for spectacle. The most important technologies are not always the ones that look impressive from a distance. Sometimes they are the ones that simply refuse to fail. Season after season, mile after mile, generation after generation, until an entire people's survival has been quietly, permanently written into their design.